I want to thank you for listening to Into the Fire. And before we start today's episode, I would like to issue an apology about last episode, which was about Ted Bundy. During that episode, I mentioned a list of Ted Bundy's victims. And when I mentioned the list, it was assumed that every one of his victims was murdered. That was in fact wrong. Carol Durant, who Bundy abducted and attempted to kill on November 8, 1974, actually lived and testified against him during his trial. While I was doing the video editing, I realized this error, but sadly it was too late to go back and re-record the episode. With that said, I do apologize for the inconsistency. I am a small YouTube channel and podcaster, so there will be mistakes made, and hopefully we rectify them in the future. Again, I apologize. Now, on to the episode. Daniel Harold Rolling was born May 26, 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana to James and Claudia Rolling. James Rolling was a local police lieutenant in Shreveport. James married Claudia when she was 19 years old. 2 weeks after they married, James found out that Claudia was pregnant with their first child. This angered James, who did not want children. When Danny was a child, James would tell him that he was unwanted from birth. James Rollins was an abusive man, as he would abuse and beat Danny, as well as Danny's mother Claudia and his brother Kevin. It was said by Danny that his father would be set off into a fit of rage for frivolous things, such as breathing in a way that would annoy him. Him and his brother would receive beatings for the smallest things. Danny would claim that one time his mother went to the hospital ER after claiming her husband tried to make her cut herself with a razor blade. Danny's mother would make repeated attempts to leave her husband, but she would eventually return shortly after, and Danny and his brother would be at the receiving end of the backlash of her leaving. James Rolling was extremely disciplinary. At one point, his father pinned Danny to the ground and handcuffed him, then had police take his son away because he stated that he was embarrassed by his own son. At one point in Danny's childhood, James beat his son's dog so often that it eventually died in Danny's arms. Later in Danny's life, he would become an animal abuser himself. The children were not allowed to celebrate birthdays or holidays such as Halloween or Christmas. They never got an affectionate word or action from their father. At the age of 11, Danny picked up music to cope with his abusive father. This was also during a time in which his mother had been committed to a hospital after she had slit her wrists. With the addition to music, Danny would eventually pick up the habit and addiction of drugs and alcohol. These habits would only worsen his already fragile mental state. This would be the start of a ticking time bomb. As Danny grew into his teenage years, he had a hard time identifying with people and became socially awkward. He was arrested several times for robberies in the state of Georgia. At one point, he was caught spying on a woman getting dressed. As he grew into adulthood, Danny had issues holding down a steady job. Danny tried to enlist in the Navy, but they wouldn't take him. He eventually joined the Air Force, which he quit after too much drug use, in which he claims included taking acid more than 100 times. After dropping out of the military, Danny eventually got married and finally began what appeared to be a normal life, but the cycle of abuse continued. In 1977, after being with his wife for 4 years, she separated from Danny after he threatened to kill her. Danny turned his devastation into anger and sexually assaulted a woman who closely resembled his ex-wife. Later that year, he killed a woman in a car accident. This would eventually fuel his dark, raging anger. His mother Claudia said that she first noticed Danny's mind shift in 1988, stating that his face got real hard, almost no emotion there at all, just kind of a deadpan expression. If I didn't know him so well, I probably wouldn't have known it was him. From the late 1970s to the 1990s, Danny Rolling would commit a series of petty crimes and thefts. If Danny did get a job, they would only last a few days before he would quit. Armed robberies allowed him to get cash to survive. He was in and out of jails in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. In 1989, Danny Rolling would return to Shreveport, Louisiana. This would be when Danny Rolling would eventually commit his first murder. According to the Shreveport Times, 8-year-old Sean Grissom was visiting his grandfather William and his aunt Julie for the weekend and part of his recent birthday, and was supposed to return home on Monday, November 6, 1989. But he never did. The next morning, Sean's mother called the police after making multiple unanswered calls to her father-in-law's house. She also learned from Sean's school that he wasn't in class. Police reached out to Grissom's neighbors, asking them to see if the residence was unlocked. At approximately 8:45 a.m., 3 neighbors went over to the brown brick home to check on the family and opened the door to the utility room off of the garage. What they found inside was a nightmare. 55-year-old William Grissom's body was slumped against the door, blocking the entrance to the utility room. He had several stab wounds in the back and chest. 8-year-old Sean Grissom was found face down in the family room with 1 knife wound to his back that exited through the front of his chest. 24-year-old Julie Grissom's body was found naked and partially hanging off a bed. She was stabbed at least 3 times in the back. It appeared that vinegar was applied to her body to remove any evidence from the killer. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacking, and no robbery. While the police always believed that Danny Rolling was responsible but could not prove it, the triple homicide would remain unsolved until 2006. Before his execution, Danny Rolling admitted to the Grissom murders in a written letter. In May of 1990, during a heated argument, Danny shot his father in the stomach in the face. James survived the shooting, but he permanently lost the use of an eye and an ear. At the time of the argument, Claudia and James were separated. In July of 1990, Danny Rolling would change his identity to Michael Kennedy Jr. with papers he stole after breaking into someone's house. He fled Shreveport and took a bus to Sarasota, Florida to start a new life. The change of scenery did not change Danny Rolling. It only made him worse. On August 24, 1990, Danny broke into the home of Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, who were freshmen at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Rolling followed them home, broke into their house, and overpowered the 2 young females. He covered their mouths with duct tape and bound their hands. Danny violently sexually assaulted them before stabbing and killing them both. Danny would soon return after the murders and perform necrophilia. There seemed to be no end to his sick and twisted madness. Rolling also went so far as to cut off the girl's nipples and to keep one as a trophy of his actions. The next day, Rolling broke into Christina Hoyt's residence, and after he sexually assaulted her, he murdered her and removed her nipples and placed them beside her. Rolling cut off her head and sat her upright on the edge of the bed. He put her head on a bookshelf, facing her headless body. On the day of Krista Hoyt's murder, police also responded to a robbery at a bank a half a mile away from her house. During the robbery, a teller had slipped a red dye pack into the bag of money, and later on that night, an officer noticed a man walking into a wooded area. The officer tracked the man to a campsite where the officer found a screwdriver along with the bag of money defaced by the red dye and a cassette player with an audio tape inside. The man they chased was never found. The evidence from the campsite was collected, but at the time, they did not connect the bank robbery to the student murders because only a gun was found at the campsite, and the murders didn't involve a gun. Unfortunately, they didn't listen to the cassette tape until months later, as that tape would eventually prove crucial to finding out who the Gainesville Ripper was.
I'm sending this to the 3 people I love the most, and I'll always love you. I love my mother, I love my father, and I love my brother.
Now I got the sky for a blanket, the earth for a bed, and some rumpled up clothes for a pillow. But it's okay. It's just the way it is. You take the good with the bad. know I'll have to run the rest of my life. But I'm getting pretty good at it. Well, I'm going to sign off for a little bit. I got something I got to do.
On August 27, 1990, Rolling broke into the home of Tracy Paulus and Manuel Taboada and murdered them. The two 23-year-olds had been close friends since high school, and they had just begun living together. Manuel had dreams of becoming an architect. Tracy was hoping to become a lawyer. Authorities believed that Manuel Taboada was the first to be attacked, and that they fought for some time before Taboada was killed by multiple stab wounds. Tracy Paulus was sexually assaulted and, like Krista Hoyt's murder, was also found posed. She had soap on her lower body as well as tape residue on her wrists and mouth. Authorities believed that Rolling didn't have time to mutilate the bodies of the deceased because he may have been in danger of getting caught or was interrupted by someone soon after the murders. The 5 murders were all committed 2 miles from each other around the University of Florida, which consequently canceled classes for a week. Students were scared, and some brought baseball bats with them everywhere they went. No one went out alone during the night or day. Thousands of students eventually left the campus, and around 700 never came back because of the fear for their own lives. Police were baffled, as they couldn't find enough evidence at the crime scenes. Danny Rolling had followed his tracks. He used cleaning solvents on the dead bodies to remove any traces of bodily fluids. At one point, police grew convinced that Ed Humphrey might be their most likely suspect. But there was one major issue. DNA testing was still in its infancy stages back in the early 1990s, but investigators were able to determine that the suspect's blood type through semen left behind at all 3 crime scenes. They found that the suspect had a type B blood, but Humphrey's blood was type A. They knew that Humphreys was not their killer, and it was back to square one for the police. It wasn't until January 1991 that Gainesville police finally caught a break. Finding similarities between the murders in Shreveport and in Gainesville, Florida, Florida investigators sought DNA of prisoners from Shreveport who were incarcerated. The DNA left at the crime scene in Gainesville had matched Danny Rolling's DNA. Soon after, Danny Rolling was arrested. Danny Rolling eventually confessed to being the Gainesville Ripper. Florida prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him of the 5 homicides. They sought the death penalty. And that is what Danny got. On October 25th, in 2006, at 52 years old, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection in the state of Florida. It was the most high-profile execution in Florida since the serial killer Ted Bundy was executed in 1989. Danny Rolling's last meal consisted of a lobster tail served with drawn butter, butterfly shrimp with cocktail sauce, a baked potato with sour cream and butter, strawberry shortcake, and sweet tea. Danny Rolling sang a hymn in the final minutes of his life. I want to thank you for listening. Feel free to give any feedback, whether it's positive or negative, as we take everything into consideration. We continue to build this podcast, and we appreciate as much feedback as possible. Thank you again for listening. Take care.